you don't have to worry about, because nothing builds too much on what has happened before, and everything should be completely independent. So if you missed all of last year or the last 4 years or something like that, you missed, it won't make any difference at all. The main purpose of all of this is to understand myths as a language of the spiritual worlds, a language of the soul that points to realities in the spiritual world that we haven't learned to see directly yet. And this is not pure mythography, where we take mythology as a subject and a world unto itself, sort of like Joseph Campbell. And it's not analytic psychology like Carl Jung, where the myths are seen as part of the psychological nature. And it's not anthropology for certain, and it's not history, and it's not poetic fiction. Though we'll touch on all of those things, the real purpose is to try and see the spiritual worlds directly through the vehicle of myth, and to attune ourselves to living in them. The talks that have come before, I should try to recapitulate what we've done. Basically, we have to familiarize everybody with what we're doing and try to understand some of the structure, and maybe in recapitulating we'll find a place that we can jump off and do the new material. We began with two myths in one talk. We talked about the myth of Prometheus and the myth of Lucifer. Both of these are myths of divine rebels. Gods, or with a small g, or divinities of some sort or another, that rallied against the totalitarian attitudes of heaven in order to come to the aid of humanity. In some cases, their help was questionable as to whether it was more harm than help, but they were rebels. And in doing that, I tried to set the tone for what the class is going to be like, in that it is going to be unique, and it's going to be new and different, and it probably will rebel against a lot of what is considered the standard outlook about mythology, or even about the spiritual life. And what we talked about mostly was the literal quality of myths. Because from a mystical point of view, gods, demons, fairies, and all kinds of magical kingdoms are spiritual realities to somebody who has opened up an inner vision. And when myths start talking about these realities, they're not just pretty tales, and they're not just allegories, but they are talking about things that are lived out and relived out as creative dramas. Because what happens on earth, and what happens in all of the lower realms for that matter, is a consequence of what happens deep, deep in the spiritual worlds. And in the spiritual worlds, the truths of reality are brought to life by being enacted, or by the drama of the gods living them into existence. So we talked about, the first time then, about rebellious spirits and some of the adventure, and then we talked about the literacy. In the next talk, we corrected, and we spent most of the time in Tartarus, which is Greek hell, and we corrected by showing that some of the myths have to be read just the opposite from what they say. And we spent a lot of time looking at people who were tortured in the inner worlds after life was over, and the tortures, as hard as they seemed, many of them were actually divine blessings creative duties. Then when we had corrected and saw that sometimes you have to take myths just as they are, and sometimes you have to take them just the opposite, we set out to work on our first sub-series. And our first sub-series was creation myths. The idea being that if we could get in touch with the Spirit ab initio, from the very first impulse of creation, if we could unite ourselves with that, we could understand the foundation and the process of everything that is going on now in the cosmos, or at least reproduced in our spiritual lives. And we started out first with a few Greek creation myths. We went right back again to the Titans, and we looked at some of the Orphic creation myths and such like that. And the next time we got together, we looked at several creation myths out of the Bible. We looked at the 3 creation stories as given in Genesis, and we looked a little bit at St. John's Gospel. The beginning was the Word, and then we hoped to get to Revelation, but we just didn't get that far. Then we looked a little bit at Native American creation myths, and then we moved to the East Indies, and we spent a lot of time on Hindu creation myths because they were the most exciting and the most rich of any that I've ever come across in terms of very far-reaching ideas. And finally, we finished up with a little bit out of a creation myth from Tibet, the stanzas of Dizan or Dizian, as given by Madame Blavatsky. Then we moved on to what could be called the flagship series of myths, because it's about, the title of the course is Mythology and the Mysteries. And so we wanted to look at myths that were stylized for the mysteries. And we talked a lot about the mysteries as being schools of initiation where people are taught where they can see for themselves where human beings have been in their past evolution, what a human is now, where they're going, and how to get there, and what are the whys behind it all. And we talked a lot about mystery schools as a way of becoming a better human being by living in touch with the principles which are sort of the essence of the essence, or the creme de la creme, or how do the French say it, the core de la core of reality. And we looked at, I believe, 4 different creation myths. We looked first at Isis, Osiris, and Horus. In the ancient world, that was probably the most influential among the highly educated of the Greeks and Romans. Many of them were initiated into the myths, into the mysteries, first of Isis and then of Osiris. And we took the Plutarch version, and like all mystery myths, that had a lot of curious details in it that you'd never figure out unless you knew the language of the mysteries. And so we did that. We told the story and saw the episodes of the death and the decimation. Actually, it was, how would you say, what comes after triodecimation? I guess that's what it would be, where the body of Osiris was cut into 13 parts, and his grieving wife, Isis, goes and collects the parts and tries to resurrect him. Then we looked at that myth with using several keys. We looked at spiritual physiology, and we saw the myth in terms of the divinities and the heavens built into the body, and that the different parts of the body represented different hierarchical consciousnesses, or different grand ideas that put together make the whole human being. sort of like the grand atom of heaven to the Kabbalists. And we also looked at, we didn't get a chance to look at mathematics or numerology at that point. We did look a little bit at some astronomy, and we saw all of the journeys of Isis in terms of new moons and full moons between spring and fall, actually through the whole year. Then we went on to look at the mysteries of Eleusis. We looked at the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and we looked at it in great detail, and we looked at the Eleusinian mysteries, and we looked at all of the details of the celebration, and then we started looking at Neoplatonism. Then we looked at all of these myths that people ripped apart and cut up and things like that. They weren't pleasant at all. Persephone gets raped, and she gets off the easiest of all of them. And all the others get ripped into pieces. We looked at Dionysus, Zagreus, Bacchus, all the same figure. And we looked at the concept of spiritual distribution as relates to initiation. And finally, at the end of the year last year, we looked at the artist's mystery myth, and that was the myth of Orpheus. And we looked at that with a bunch of very strange recondite mystery outlooks. And about that time I was all set to quit giving talks. And then I stewed on it all summer and realized how much I hadn't said and how much I had said it wrong, and decided to start all over and to continue on from where we left off. Only now we're in a new sub-series. And I want to take up where we left off about the mysteries. We said that in the ancient world, I have a number of readings if you're interested in them. In the ancient world, the people who had gone through the mysteries were markedly changed, dramatically changed. Their character from what it was to what it became was altogether different over the course of participating in the mysteries. And in all cases, it was much improved, especially morally and ethically improved. And actually, when you think about it, evolution is just a fancy word of talking, describing improvement. Things get better, and we work toward better times. The important thing that we noted about the mystery myths and the students who went through the mysteries was that their improvement was recognized even by people who were skeptics, people who didn't believe in spiritual worlds, who didn't believe in unfolding divine powers, but yet they saw these people were changed, and they saw that it wasn't just a matter of improvement, but there was such a thing that they had more charisma, they had more influence and more power, and it wasn't just social power, it came from them. Now, when we're dealing with mythology, we're dealing with something symbolic. And when you're dealing with something symbolic, from an astrological point of view, you're dealing with Neptune. Neptune is the planet that has to do with what are called the mercurial mysteries. Now, anybody who's at all familiar with astrology or has done any work with it understands that where Neptune is involved is a place in life where one is likely to illusion and confusion and misperception, and it can be pretty treacherous and even dangerous when it comes to spiritual things, because a person thinks that they're safe or thinks that they're invulnerable and tries to project himself out of their body into the world, thinking that they're divinely projected, and find themselves in an insane asylum or something like that because they weren't protected as much as they thought. So when we're dealing with mystery myths and when we're dealing with initiation and spiritual unfoldment, we have to be very, very careful about illusion, about seeing things differently than they really are. And one of the first illusions that most folks have about initiations is that they are a ceremony, that merely by passing through a ceremony you become a changed person. Well, in the first place, in the modern times, in our times, if you're initiated, it's very rare that there ever is a ceremony. It more or less is a realization, a very profound realization of your part in the spiritual worlds and what you are capable of and what you have done. And then you, with that kind of realization, you can then start tapping the powers that you have. Initiation is an inward activity. It's not an activity that has anything to do with any outward ceremony. And the ceremony, if there is any, is merely a supportive kind of set of external symbols. So initiation is inward work. And work is the proper word because if you've ever tried over a long period of time, say like a year or 2 years, to without fail turn inward in whatever you do, a prayer or meditation or some kind of contemplative type of work, if you ever try to do that every day without fail, say for as short as a half an hour, and try to reach more deeply within each day, if you try to do that, you realize it really is work. It's work to just do it, and then to try and reach more and more deeply into yourself without getting lost or without clocking out or something like that. It really is work. So its work and initiation is a high point in that kind of work. It's sort of like, it's almost what happens in evolution. Things build up and up and up, and animals, humans, plants very slowly evolve and adapt to the current conditions, and they begin to specialize. And then comes something like the initiation. There's a very big critical change. And those that can readapt to the new level continue on in evolution. But there isn't an evolutionary crisis all the time. Most of the time it's a slow, steady kind of work, and then you have a profound kind of change, and that profound kind of change is what the initiation is. And it does, even if it's not an initiation per se, just if you're every day working on trying to understand the truth of something, and you work at it and work at it and work at it, and nothing comes, and you think that you're crazy and that you're going down the wrong path or something like that, and all of a sudden you make the breakthrough, and it seems like a really profound kind of thing. That's what initiation really is. It represents a change of state, and that change of state is only possible by the kind of life that precedes it. Unless you live a given way, and unless you develop yourself, the opportunity for initiation may arise, and it can't come because you don't have anything ready. If you haven't strung the bow, there's no way that you can project the arrow. Sure. Yeah. there would be no way that you could doubt it. Sometimes there's someone there to help you. Almost always there is someone there to help you, but you may not even be aware of their presence. But in a heightened moment of consciousness, in all heightened moments of consciousness, the moment is greatly expanded and your consciousness is expanded with it. So that past and future are absorbed into a greater now. And a large part of the past is one finds oneself out of the body. And it's not so important whether you're in the body or out, and whether you even notice it really at that point. It's almost very much like Paul describes his experience of the Christ. He said, I knew a man above 7 years ago, whether in the body or not, I know not. And when the first thing that happens when anyone leaves the body in a normal manner is that everything that we have been building up by proceeding forward in life, we sort of hold that in check. And when you leave the body, that gets released. And in effect, you see as much of your past life as you're capable of bearing. And you see literally what you have done, and you re-experience the consequences of what you have done according to the people who have received the fruits of your deeds. And for many people, that's not a very pleasant thing, because if you have angry thoughts or deeds or things like that, you feel the full brunt of the anger. Moreover, paralleling that, you also relive a very ancient, deep, deep past part of your spiritual evolution. As much as you can bear, you see your past and you absorb it into you. And then when you can face the reality of yourself and absorb as much of that into you as you can, then the moment, your recognition of the moment when the preoccupation of what has been has worn off, then you get intimations of what could be as a consequence of your past deeds and as a consequence of your potential. Because one of the very first things that happens is that you realize that you are God. And in that realization, you understand more and more parts of your soul being. And as you understand those parts, you understand them as your future destiny. And you can see as much of your future destiny as you're capable of at that time. And that's the initiation.
Do you get like parts and then it stops for like a long time?
It all depends on the soul character of the individual. There are successive initiations in which you get liberated from more and more of your past and review more of your history and see more of the potential of the future. And those successive steps depend on, again, how you live. For anyone to take even one initiation is a very, very remarkable circumstance. It's one in many millions of people at our time in life that can be so prepared to take an initiation like that. And there are some very great spirits who can plow through as many as a half a dozen in one life. And of all of the mystery schools that I've encountered, the normal liberation from our kind of existence with working very hard takes about 3 or 4 incarnations. Now I myself am not an initiate, so I cannot say that this is exactly how it all goes. But from the high points that I do have in myself and from intimations and hints that I have, this appears to be what the mysteries are like, as well as comparing it to things from students. There's quite a bit written about the mysteries. We're going to mention a book tonight that was written about 1,600 years ago, where the person talks quite literally about seeing the midnight sun and all of those things, like you can see right through the earth and see the sun in the etheric realms. And that's, there have been a lot of things that have been said by people, as much as can be said, for, every age has the initiates that will say. Yeah? No. Everything in the modern initiation, it is not a modern initiation unless it's something that takes place in full waking consciousness. It used to be that people had to be like, maybe 3,000-4,000 years ago, people had to be put into trances and they had to be protected by other beings and such like that. But in the modern initiation, that is not the case. In fact, in ancient times, you had to be born to families where you could get certain genetic materials in order to be able to do that. And that's also not true in our times. Okay.
Do you have any ideas on actual numbers and percentage? Like we have a lot of people on the earth now. Is it the same percentage of the initiates now as there was 2,000 or 3,000 years ago?
I think it goes by seasons. I'll take the easy route out, and I'll take quotes by Plato, that there are within the precessional cycle, there are times that there are seasons that are just like seasons for harvesting. Like right now it's getting to be apple harvesting season. And there are seasons when initiation is much more ripe. And that goes a lot by, there's a famous old maxim that I like very much, and the seasons are indicated by that maxim. And it says, the stars shine the brightest when the night is the darkest. And so when things are really, really difficult on earth, and there are a lot of people suffering, those are the times that the world needs the most help, and those are the times that people rise to the effort and care. It's always people, like a lot of people were initiated during the times of the plagues, and they were initiated through their work in trying to help people in those very, very trying times. In the last several hundred years, 200 or so years, there have not been so many people initiated at any given time, because the whole tone of the earth was materialistic, and there weren't many people that were even interested. And it was even necessary for them to carry out the things like the blind kind of science that we have now, preparatory to another stage of evolution. But now we're coming to the time again when things are going to get really, really hard, and so there'll probably be another season where there will be more initiates. Okay. So it is this conscious striving to live that is sometimes called the work, or the alchemists called it the great work or the great experiment. In all of this striving to grow, it's important to note that the striving has to be like the goal itself and like the work itself. And in the same way that a ceremony is outer when the reality of initiation is inner, so also are the goals and the ideals. Like people can tell you what their ideals are or what their goals are, but they're meaningless. What is meaningful is finding within the structure of yourself a path. a stratified way of getting closer and closer to the center of your being. And so the goals, the ideals, the way itself is totally within ourselves. And the more we come to rely on that, and the more we come to look at our internal geography, the more quickly we will drop some of the illusions of the outward being the truth of all things. In fact, we're going to talk, maybe I don't know if it'll be this year or not, I doubt it'll be this year, but I want to talk about mythography, mythological geography, of where all the different worlds are and things like that. It should be a fun thing to go into. So, what we're striving for is not only a quality of life and action, and we're not only striving for powers and talents, we are seeking to become and live out and use to full purpose our character, what we are, because we are the universe, we are God. So, we're seeking our divine pedigree. And to do that, at least for most of this year, we're going to look at myths about people who are seeking. In some cases, they'll be quite literal, and in some cases, they'll be highly symbolic. And we're going to look at myths of heroes and heroines. And we're going to look at them as being myths, not as the Jungians claim of ego building, which is a perfectly worthwhile activity, but we're going to look at them as myths of self-becoming. We're going to look at the work along the way, we're going to look at the objectives along the way, and we're going to try in that to find things in our lives, like I work in a computer room most of the day. It's kind of hard to find the spiritual worlds and the mythical life in a computer room, but it can be done. And so in that, we're going to take those stories and look at them in terms of our soul growth, in terms of our aspirations. We're not going to be really comprehensive about this because this is one of the biggest parts of all mythology and folklore. In fact, if we were to be comprehensive about all of the different hero and heroine myths, we would be here probably the rest of my life because I have a shelf full of, I must have about that many books on mythology and fairy tales and such, just the myths and tales themselves, without the different ways that people have looked at them. And by far the greatest number of them are hero myths or heroine myths. So we're not going to be comprehensive. I'm going to pick out a few that I do understand a little bit about it and work with that. I'm going to try and take the things that I can deal with the most, in a most fresh and genuine kind of manner. Because there's one thing that we want to do is we want to remain enthusiastic. And that's something that the hero and heroine myths have. They have that enthusiasm, that zest for life, and the feeling of triumph and majesty and all of those sorts of things. But we have to be very self-conscious about this, because if we're not self-conscious, there is indeed a process that I think the psychologists help us a lot with, and that is identification. Identification with the hero or the heroine is a subconscious activity where it's sort of like the mythological version of a soap opera, where instead of living and facing your own life, you put your whole identity into the life of the myth or of the soap opera, and you're living an unreal sort of thing. In fact, there have been a number of people that are considered very high gurus that have become subject to this kind of illusion. One of these gurus, if he had got into an automobile accident, he would say it was because he was supposed to spill blood on this continent, and he wasn't admitting that he still had any destiny yet. And he used to like to go to movies a lot, which is all right, but it wasn't he just said I like to go to movies. But what he said is, I go and sit in the movie theater and I enlighten people while they're watching the movie because in such a state they're open and I can fill them with my being. You see what I mean? That you can get into the part of playing something you really aren't, and you have to be very self-conscious about what you are and what you aren't. And we have to also be careful about getting too much into ego-building things. Now, ego-building is an important thing in life because in our divided self we have a large number of eyes. Like the Bible says, the beast has many eyes. You can spell that E-Y-E, or you can spell it just plain eye. And it's very important that we begin to differentiate a center, or at least a dual center. And what most people would consider schizophrenic dichotomy is very important in the spiritual life because the phenomenal part of us needs to ask questions and the divine part needs to give answers. The phenomenal part needs to collect information and the divine part needs to glean that information for the truth that is within it. And so ego building is not all bad, provided that we don't become escapist about it. I think my first experience, a self-conscious experience about escapist kind of fantasy and mythology occurred when I got clobbered by the bully. For weeks thereafter, I had all sorts of images of myself beating him up, where it got to be so absurd that I had images of myself having a tiger or something like that and walloping him. This was when I was a kid, and these things can happen. They can happen even as an adult. If we do, this is the first thing that happens. Psychologists call it regression. If we don't meet and pass through our challenges, if we don't meet evolution and grow and become, if we deny the divinity within ourselves, then all of that energy that is normally put into creative work, that is normally put into self-development, gets turned back on ourselves and we get into all kinds of really rancid type of fantasy. And we don't even build ego in that. We just, just becomes very difficult. It gets to be undermining. So we are trying to transform ourselves and to do so without wasting our energy. So we're going to try and look at this in a really simple way and in a harmonious way and an enthusiastic way. So we'll look at our first myth of the year. And this year this time I'm going to try doing something different. In fact, every time we've gone into a myth or a new series, we've gone about it in a different way. This will be the first time we look at a fairy tale. So far, all we've looked at are high myths. And now we're going to look at folk art. And fairy tales are really good because they cut out all of the ponderous kind of activity that one can get into, and in that become lost to the real purpose of things. But in fairy tales, it's all there in the fairy tales, or the elements of it are all there. Like, for example, if you look at the fairy tale of the goose who laid the golden egg. Now, that is none other than one of the deepest of all creation myths, the myth of the black swan that lays the golden egg of light. And that has to do with the very beginning where the black swan is a representation of the consciousness of the ever unknown and unknowable absolute, wherein we manifest conscious outward being as the supreme being. And so the golden egg is laid or becomes within the absolute, which has always been known as darkness. And it's a very, very profound creation story. But when you see it in the terms of the goose that laid the golden egg, it becomes something really simple. And as I recall the story, one should not get too greedy, and one should not destroy the source of all of that lovely golden light by trying to cut it apart with too much material analysis or something like that. As you remember, didn't he kill the goose and cut it apart, hoping to find many, many golden eggs instead of just one a day? I don't know. But at any rate, we're going to look at the myth. It's a Norwegian myth called East of the Sun and West of the Moon. Think ahead, huh? Now, we could have continued right on from where we left off in the mystery myths last year. We could have done that because there's a version in classical mythology in a very much misunderstood work. The work is called, in the fancy name, it's called the Metamorphosis. And in the unfancy name, it's called the Golden Ass. And it was written by Lucius of Apuleius, who was a high initiate and even a priest while he was a lawyer in Rome. And he entered into the myths, into the mysteries first of Isis and then of the mysteries of Osiris. And he was living, I think he was contemporaneous with Plutarch, or maybe just a generation or so afterward. And he wrote this, what is called the Ribald Classic. And it's a story that's filled with all kinds of naughty, naughty tales. And the main part of the thing is that the hero gets turned into an ass. And he has all of these adventures while he's an ass. And eventually, just at the time when he is supposed to perform stud with a Roman woman before a coliseum of people, he is redeemed by Isis and initiated into, I can't even say it, he's initiated into the mysteries of Isis. And this is where he talks about seeing the midnight sun and all of those sorts of things. And this is a theme, if you're familiar with Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, somebody gets turned into an ass there for the same reason. And if you remember, the ass played a large part in both the Eleusinian mysteries and the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. And if you remember the story of Demeter and Persephone, when Demeter is being a wet maid at the house of the king, she is tried to be raised up in her spirits by the old maid there telling her all of these dirty stories. And we won't go into that because it's very far afield. But it was in the Lucius of Apuleius, it's called the myth of Cupid and Psyche. And it's almost identical. There are quite a few more things added into Cupid and Psyche, but if you read one and then the other, you say, yeah, this can't be anything but the same story. And this is one of the little stories that occurs inside of the whole big story, which is a collection of stories within stories in the Golden Ass, or in the Metamorphosis. But I want to look at start looking at different temperaments and how myths come out in different temperaments. And in Norse mythology, things come out with very great simplicity. And I think it's important that we keep with that simplicity. Okay. I'm going to do this a little bit differently than we've done it ever before. I'm going to read the whole story. There's only about a dozen pages. But I'm not a good reader, so I'll have to take a lot of breaks in the middle. East of the sun and west of the moon. Once upon a time, there was a poor husbandman that had so many children that he hadn't much of either food or clothing to give them. Pretty children they all were, but the prettiest was the youngest daughter, who was so lovely there was no end to her loveliness. That's enough right there. Once upon a time is my fear is that chalk gets inside of the. I think we've all had the experience of getting involved in something and losing all sense of time. And that's very much what it's like getting used to the inner worlds. That when one turns inward, time and space and all of the other things that we associate with them, like duration and size and how near something is, all of those things get very much out of whack. And anytime you hear the classical once upon a time, that's setting you up. It's putting you not into a fantasy world, but into a world where you have to look at things with a much different framework of measurement than we have now. Then we come to the thing of many, many children. This is going to be interpretation. I'll read a little, interpret a little, read a little, interpret a little. Many children. Now, there are a number of ways. We're going to stick with only one interpretive stream of this from the hero-heroine point of view. And we're right back at a symbol we talked about earlier. The beast has many eyes. And in the course of a day, in all kinds of circumstances, we find out that we have many eyes also. We represent ourselves to many people in many different ways, and some of those ways are quite stylized. And all of those are different identities. And it isn't until we come to the youngest, which means the last born, the one that is the identity of all other identities, that we really come to what we are. There's something fresh and new that it's sort of like the whole idea that all of the evolution of the animals led up to a human being. That each of the animals is a specialization in some quality, either the ability to fly swiftly or to have a strong jaw or to do something like that, until finally you come to a human being which is basically weak. But it has the spirit within itself. It has the waking self-consciousness. It is the last born, and therefore it is the youngest. And something like that happens in ourself. When we are born to the spiritual path, we recognize something that is so beautiful. Again, this is a whole idea of eternity or infinity. She was so beautiful, there was no end to her beauty. And beauty in this regard, relative, if you look at all of the things that human beings do now, they produce ugliness. Whereas things that are in nature, that are produced by nature, are always magically beautiful. And I think our lives produce ugliness until we begin to sense the Spirit and to respond to the Spirit inside of ourselves, and then everything becomes beautiful after that. Okay. So one day, 'twas a Thursday evening, late at the fall of the year, the weather was so wild and rough outside that it was so cruelly dark, and rain fell and wind blew till the walls of the cottage shook again. There they sat around the fire, busy with this thing and that. But just then, All at once something gave 3 taps on the window pane. Then the father went out to see what was the matter. But when he got out of doors, what should he see but a great big white bear? "Good evening to you," said the white bear. "The same to you," said the man. Well, the bear doesn't mess around. He gets to the point right away. He says, "Will you give me your youngest daughter? If you will, I will make you as rich as you are now poor," which is an interesting proposition. I don't know how you measure it even. Said the bear, "Well, the man would not be at all sorry to be so rich, but still he thought he must have a bit of a talk with his daughter first. So he went in and told them how there was a great white bear waiting outside who had given his word to make them so rich if he could only have the youngest daughter." We're immediately in drama, and this comes to a point that this is something that we talked a little bit about when we talked about Isis and Osiris, but in the spiritual worlds, it's something like being in the dream state, because the dream state is a quasi-spiritual state. Things are always a little askew and they're too much materialized, but in the spiritual worlds, the meanings of the spiritual worlds are pinned down in events. It is as if the fluid spirit must, in order to fulfill itself, it must produce things, and it comes to know itself in objectified things. And that experience is understood in the mythical representation of the spiritual worlds by details. Now, the details are very, very important. Like in the dream, the general setting is one thing, and that has an importance. But usually the key to understanding your dream is some curious little detail. You start focusing on that thing that doesn't fit in, and suddenly everything else all fits together just right. And so this is true of the stories also. It's a Thursday, which to the Norse is a very important day, because Thursday was their high day. It was Thor's day, and everything that was going to happen, that was going to unfold for the better and for the positive, would occur on Thor's Tag. And it was bad weather. It was concentrated weather. And whether you know it or not, there are a lot of ideas and reports there. You're familiar with that play at the end by Shakespeare, The Tempest, where all of the magic takes place in a time of great storms and such like that. Well, in the vortices, in the heart of a cyclone where everything is spinning, that is a place where it is very clear, where it's a very thin gate between this world and that. In fact, all of the seership experiences have to do with the opening of a vortex in the inner worlds associated with an area right near the center of your forehead, between the center and the root of the nose. And the whole vortical spinning kind of idea represents a place where there's like a point or like a gateway between this world and that. And so what they're talking about here is, in this kind of intense circumstance, something very miraculous is likely to happen. The thing that happens here is what is called lycanthropy. That's where human beings are turned into animals, or spiritual beings are turned into animals. And it all depends on what kind of, what part of the world you live in. This would be, in some cases, this would be called a werbear. It's only down south that they had werewolves. Up north they had werbears. But this one had all white, he had all white hair, meaning to say that there was a great potential for good or a great potential for purity. This wasn't a black bear. This was a white bear. And what happens here is the lower part always introduces or tempts us into seeking the higher, but it does so for its own good. Meaning to say that one of the most profound people I've ever heard of in my life learned all about the spiritual worlds because he figured that if he knew people's secrets, he could take advantage of them. And so he tried to develop clairvoyance in order to take advantage of people, and along the way he just got turned into something very wonderful when he realized the divine character of things. And this is what happens to this in this circumstance. The temptation is here. I will make you rich if you engage me in my outlook, and that's sometimes what happens. And the Father, in this case, represents the warden, or represents that which gives approbation in ourselves, and the Father allows this to take place. His most beautiful daughter, he is allowing this to take place. Nothing ever takes place in life, period, but especially on the spiritual path, without our freely consenting to it. And there is such a thing that there is a trust. The best way that you can help people is to trust in them and have faith in their ability to do things. And if you remember the initiatory story of the Old Testament, the story of Job is a story of initiation. And Job was allowed to be put into the clutches of the devil, and in the story. And that's sort of what we're dealing with here. We're saying that there's a very great faith in what lives in this daughter, that he's willing to give her up. The lassie said no outright. Nothing could get her to say anything else. So the man went out and settled it with the bear that he should come again next Thursday evening and get an answer. Meantime, he talked his daughter over, strange grammar, and kept telling her of all the riches they would get and how well off she would be herself. So at last she thought better of it, and washed and mended her rags, and made herself as smart as she could, and was ready to start. I can't say packing gave her much trouble. We always say no at first, partly because we're blinded by our material perception, and we identify ourselves in our egoistic way. We identify with skepticism, the ability to be able to say that that's not so gives us some kind of divine power before we have the creativity to be creative beings in ourselves. We manifest it by saying no to other things. This is, I think, a lot of what's behind a lot of the killing that takes place in the world, because people can at least feel strong in taking life if they can't give it yet. And then there's always a dread of sacrifice. If we have any little bit of ego in us at all, there's a dread that, this is going to be painful for me. I'm going to have to work. And, it's like getting out of bed every morning. And if we want to not be poor, and we don't even know how poor we are now, we're as poor as the little girl, and if we don't know how poor we are, and we're going to be that way until we really do invest in the Spirit. Thursday evening came the white bear to fetch her, and she got upon his back with her bundle, and off they went. So when they had gone a bit of a way, the white bear said, "Are you afraid?" No, she wasn't. "Well, mind and hold tight by my shaggy coat, and then there's nothing to fear," said the bear. The first thing we have to overcome is fear. I don't know about you, but I'm at this point yet, I guess I still don't trust. I don't have enough love, and I don't have enough faith, but I have these things I almost come back to my body sometimes with dangerous speed, so like ka-chunk, the whole body, the whole bed shakes when you come back. And that's basically because you don't trust in what's in you. But in order to begin such a journey, you have to be fearless. This is again a detail, like this is the very first dialogue that really takes place between the two principals in the story. He says, "Are you afraid?" And she says, "No, you can't be afraid. You just have to go ahead and do it." So she rode a long, long way till they came to a great steep hill. There on the face of it, the white bear gave a knock, and a door opened, and they came into a castle where there were many rooms all lit up, rooms gleaming with gold and silver, and there too was a table laid with all that was as grand could be. Then the white bear gave her a silver bell, and when she wanted anything, she was only to ring it, and she would get it at once. Mountains, high places, they're hollow, meaning that they're invisible. You know, that when you see the midnight sun, some people, even though they've been trained about the spiritual worlds, when they first have that experience and they see the midnight sun, usually at Christmas Eve, they look through the earth and they scream, not for beauty, but because they place so much security in the earth and how stable it is, and such, it's so big that we can't even much grasp the size of it, and all of our security is placed in it. So a hollow mountain is something that is representative of a high state of consciousness that one can see through. Now, if you note in here, all the rooms are well lit, and when you get into the spiritual world, that's exactly the way things are. The brighter the light, the more your eye likes it, or you can even say your eye, the more you like it. But the light is not like directional like it is from the sun where you have shadows, but everything has its own light. And according to the character of its attained spirituality, that's how bright the light is. And according to the quality of the character is the color of the light. So she's in a room, in a place where there are many, many rooms, very much like Christ says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." And they're all filled with wealth. Now, you knock on it to open it up, meaning to say that the whole process of opening to the spiritual world is a sound process. And that by the assertion of sound, by speaking words, is the way we open things up. He knocks on the mountain, she tinkles the bell, and that's the way things get opened. And words are especially important in here. We haven't come to the words yet. But if you remember, are you familiar with the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves? They come to the mountain and they open it with words. And that's a common thing to Arabic mythology. In fact, they used to, when the sesame seeds, remember Alibaba said, "Open sesame"? And the sesame seed grows in little pods. And the ancient Chaldean priests used to take the neophytes out at the right season, and by uttering a sound from deep back in his throat that was sort of not like a hypertone, but he set up a vibration, the seed pods would split open. And that was to demonstrate to the students the power of the word. And that gets carried into Arabic mythology as open sesame, as a magical word, meaning tone power, something like that. We get more and more reading, less and less commentary as we go on. Well, after she had eaten and drunk and evening wore on, she got sleepy after her journey and thought she would like to go to bed. So she rang the bell, and she had scarce taken hold of it before she came into a chamber where there was a bed made as fair and white as anyone would wish to sleep in. with silken pillows and curtains and gold fringe. All that was in the room was gold or silver, but when she had gone to bed and put out the light, a man came in and laid himself alongside her. That was the white bear who now threw off his beast shape at night, but she never saw him, for he always came after she had put out the light, and before the day dawned he was up and off again. So things went on happily for a while, but at last she began to get silent and sorrowful, for there she went about all day alone. She longed to go home to see her father and mother and brothers and sisters. So one day, when the bear asked what it was that she lacked, she said, it was so dull and lonely, and how she longed to go home to see her father and mother and brothers and sisters, and that was why she was so sad and sorrowful, because she couldn't get to them. This is sort of what it's like early on the path, when you first realize that there is a justice, that there is a creative power in you, and that ultimately all things are working to some positive end. It seems like everything is going your way. Everything you want is there for you. There's no problems at all. But because your orientation is still very egoistic, you become bored. If I hear the word boredom, I think egoism. If I hear the word ennui, I think big egoism. Because it's like a person is saying, I'm so good I need to be entertained. Or I'm so good that it takes something really amazing to move me. Whereas if it's the other way around, if a person has humility, there is a flow coming through them, and they're curious about everything, and they have wonder about everything, and there's something that moves one on in a joyous life all the time. And so our heroine is growing up. She's had her way for quite a while, and she sees that getting your own way is not what you really want. But she makes the mistake, and she wants to go back. You change your life, and you really do change, and you live it for a while, but you recognize that something isn't right, and you never admit to yourself that it isn't you, that you're not striving hard enough, or that you're not looking in the right places. And so you think, well, I think I'll go back and see my friends, and by now the old friends don't want to have anything to do with you because they think you're uppity or something like that. Whether you are or not, it doesn't make any difference. That's the way they see it, because sometimes they get defensive about their lives. And you just can't go back to that kind of state. So we try to go back, and so she does. Well, well, said the bear, perhaps there's a cure for all of this. He's a wise bear. But you must promise me one thing, not to talk alone with your mother, but only when the rest are by to hear. For she'll try to take you by the hand and try to lead you into a room alone to talk. But you must mind and not do that, else you'll bring bad luck on both of us. So, one Sunday the white bear came and said they now could go off to see her father and mother. Well, off they started, she sitting on his back, and after they went far and long, at last they came to a grand house, and there her brothers and sisters were running about out of doors at play, and everything was so pretty, it was a joy to see. This is where your father and mother live now, said the white bear. But don't forget what I told you, else you'll make us both unlucky. No, bless her, she'd not forget. And when she had reached the house, the white bear turned about and left her. So she's all the way back now. And you notice that things have switched as she has grown a little bit and has changed, and she is not self-oriented, but she is more cosmically centered now. She doesn't realize it yet, but the action has shifted from a Thursday to a Sunday. And it's a different kind of trend. Now, the thing that's important here is twice or 3 times he gives her a warning. I don't know how to say it, but I've never had anything bad happen in my life where I didn't have warning first. And many times, inwardly, all kinds of intuitive warnings were screaming in my ears, but I didn't listen. And that's one of the things when you learn to listen is when there is that silent, quiet, intuitive warning, but she doesn't take it. Then when she went in to see her father and mother, there was such joy there was no end to it. None of them thought they could thank her enough for all she had done for them. Now they had everything they wished, as good could be, and they all wanted to know how she got on where she lived. Well, she said it was very good to live where she did. She had all she wished. What she said beside, I don't know, but I don't think any of them had the right end of the stick or that they got much out of her. But so in the afternoon, after they had done dinner, all happened as the white bear had said. Her mother wanted to talk with her alone in her bedroom. She minded what the white bear had said and wouldn't go upstairs. Oh, what we have to talk about will keep, she said, and put her mother off. But somehow or other, her mother got around her at last, and she had to tell the whole of her story. She said how every night when she had gone to bed, a man came and lay down beside her as soon as she had put out the light, and how she had never seen him because he was always up and away before the morning dawned, and how she went about woeful and sorrowing, for she thought she would so like to see him, and how all day long she walked about there all alone, and how dull and dreary and lonesome it was. My, said her mother, it may be a troll you slept with, but now I'll teach you a lesson how to set eyes on him. I'll give you a bit of candle which you can carry home in your bosom. Just light that while he is asleep, but take care not to drop tallow on him. Yes, she took the candle and hid it in her bosom, and as night drew on, the white bear came and fetched her away. But when they had gone a bit of the way, the white bear asked if all hadn't happened as he had said. Well, she couldn't say it hadn't. Now mind you, he said, if you have listened to your mother's advice, you have brought bad luck on us both. And then all that has passed between us will be as nothing. Of course, she doesn't know that much has passed between them yet at this point. That's the way it is. I think we're learning more lessons even on the spiritual path. That we're learning all kinds of things all the time, don't even know that it's going on. And all at once it dawns on us and say, oh, that's what was becoming in me all along. No, she said, she hadn't listened to her mother's advice. Ah, that's it right there. The lie, that always gets you into trouble. Every character in a dream is ourself, and every character and every object and every action in a myth that we are drawn to is also ourself. And the more we can consciously with the true self, which is the attention placer, if we can consciously place the attention in these objects or in these different people, we can see what they are. It is a kind of clairvoyance to see others as they see themselves. True clairvoyant science is when we can actually put ourselves into the consciousness of any other being and have the consciousness that they have while they're having it without ever losing touch of our own self-consciousness. And the same is true if we want to understand the hero or heroine myth. We must put ourselves in the consciousness of everyone in the story. The mother represents everything that's aged, what you might say of old worldly wise knowledge of our lower focus of self. Mind you, this is all from the feminine point of view. The next time we get together in 2 weeks, we'll look at a myth, or begin to look at a myth that's from a masculine point of view. We'll look at a few from each point of view. But so she sees herself also as her mother. And there is something that is very skeptical, very selfish. We don't want to lose anything, so don't give yourself over to this. Take a look at what you're really seeing, and it's be sensible, meaning senses in the visible, physical senses. And she gets alone with the world. And that's a big mistake. If you've once taken the spiritual life, you must know, like that ancient Chinese proverb, if a fool continues in his folly, he will become wise. But she doesn't. She gets alone with her mother, which means she gives herself back over to that worldly kind of condition again. And so doubt and suspicion and all of those things that cause us to look back like Lot's wife, to look back at the way things were and get turned to stone. And so she lies. And we all know from the Bible, in the Old Testament, the sin against the Holy Ghost is the abuse of the creative energy which drove us from the Garden of Eden. In this case, what prohibits her from getting back into the Garden of Eden is what in Matthew's Gospel is called the sin against the Holy Ghost, lying. Yeah, the two are really tied together. I used to, when I was a very young man, I hung around with men that, I don't know how you'd call them. I guess you'd call them philanderers, would be the only word. They were shoot-down artists. And when they tried to pick up women, you know what they'd say? They would walk up to women and say, let me tell you some beautiful lies. And that's the way they were really upfront about the fact of what they were doing. And so if you don't listen to those warnings of the Spirit, and if you turn around while trying to live the life of truth and live in a lie, you've set yourself up for suffering right off the bat. And when you try to lie to yourself, which is really an impossible thing to do, if you can face yourself, it's the hardest thing in the world to do. If you can face yourself, or if you can face God, like if in your deepest and most devotional prayers you can put your attention so that you can talk to the divine face to face, it takes years and years and years to even be able to take a little glint straight face to face. But when you try to deflect into lies, you've really blown it there. You just asked, as a truth seeker, you really asked for it. So when she reached home and had gone to bed, it was the old story over again. There came a man and lay down beside her. But at the dead of night, when she heard he slept, she got up and struck a light, lit the candle, and let the light shine on him. And so she saw that he was the loveliest prince one had ever set eyes on. And she fell so deep in love with him on the spot that she thought she couldn't live if she didn't give him a kiss there and then. And so she did. But as she kissed him, she dropped 3 hot drops of tallow on his shirt, and he woke up. "What have you done?" he cried. Now you have made us both unlucky. For had you held out only this 1 year, I had been freed. For I have a stepmother who has bewitched me, so that I am a white bear by day and a man by night. But now all ties are snapped between us. Now I must set off from you to her. She lives in a castle which stands east of the sun and west of the moon, and there too is a princess with a nose 3 ells long, and she is the wife I must have now. So she wept and took it ill, but there was no help for it. Go he must. Then she asked if she mightn't go with him. No, she mightn't. Tell me the way then, she said, and I'll search you out. That surely I may get leave to do. Yes, she might do that, he said, but there was no way to that place. It lay east of the sun and west of the moon, and thither she'd never find her way. So what she's done is she has turned the false light, the light, when we see things with these eyes, we're always seeing images upside down because we're looking through a lens. And we're looking through a very much, not a direct process at all. We're looking through a sensory process where we're going through many different kinds of impulses before the vision ever gets to us. And so there's a lot of illusion here, and she's taking a light and she's looking in an inverted way. But even in that inverted way, the beauty is tremendous. It's very tremendous. But there are all of those superstitions, about you're not supposed to see the bride before the marriage. We're talking about an alchemical marriage where the 2 foci of ourselves get unified into one being and they converse with each other ever after. It'd be nice to have somebody that you could always talk to and it would never was a bad conversation. That's what it's like. And because of that, she has taken the consciousness and she has forced this world into the soul world, and she has contaminated it. She's put like sunspots, so to speak, on the true light. So she has her curiosity, her selfish curiosity has gotten her into trouble. There was a term of trial, and unless we understand cycles, and a year is the most common cycle for most people, even more so than the day, because we recognize the seasons of a whole year. If we could live something out to the full term of its cycle, we could make a significant change. But if we begin to doubt just at the time that it's the most crucial that we don't, that's when we are likely to fail. And so she has broken the terms of the trial, and now she has to do it a different way. How does the Old Testament say? By the sweat of thy brow and by sorrow and suffering. And that's the way she's going to have to do it. And she is given the impossible challenge, and that's what it is with the spiritual worlds, that from the material point of view, you're always asked to do something impossible, because the material world only knows beginnings and ends. And you can take tasks that have concrete goals. But in the spiritual worlds, when you think about things that are eternal, or you think about things that are infinite, then you have to unfold to an infinite type of consciousness. But if you're still looking at the material world, it looks like an impossible challenge, and that's what she's presented with. I don't know if we're going to get this all in a short 90 minutes. I thought we'd have plenty of time, but I guess I'll have to. And I just got words from a friend who's listening to these talks in Germany saying, don't ever tell people it's going to be a short talk. You know it's never going to be, so don't ever mislead people. So next morning, when she woke up, both prince and castle were gone, and there she lay on a little green patch in the midst of a gloomy thick wood, and by her side lay the same bundle of rags she had brought with her from her old home. So when she rubbed the sleep out of her eyes and wept until she was tired, she set out on her way and walked many, many days until she came to a lofty crag. Under it sat an old hag playing with a golden apple, which she tossed about. Her lassie asked if she knew the way to the prince who lived with his stepmother in the castle that lay east of the sun and west of the moon, and who was to marry the princess with a nose 3 ells long. "How did you come to know about him?" asked the old hag. "But maybe you are the lassie who ought to have had him." Yes, she was. So, it's you, is it?" said the old hag. "Well, all I know about him is that he lives in the castle that lies east of the sun and west of the moon, and thither you'll come late or never. But still you may have the loan of my horse, and on him you can ride to my next neighbor. Maybe she'll be able to tell you, and when you get there, just give the horse a switch under the left ear and beg him to be off home, and stay. This golden apple you may take with you." So she's back to reality to begin with, and she's on with her serious quest. It's her work. And it seems like, I don't know how to say it. Sometimes it seems like the spiritual reality isn't anywhere. Then you make a breakthrough, and it seems like it's everywhere, and you're like you couldn't have, how could you have missed it all so much before? And that's what she's looking for. She's looking for a place that is right here all the time, but really not getting there. And she sets off walking, meaning to say she's back in physical reality. She has to walk. And when she gets to the old hag gives her an apple. I'm going to speed this up and cut some stuff out, otherwise we'll be way too late. Gives her an apple. And an apple is, clearly it's a fruit. And it's a representation of creativity. She has been given a potential power of the Spirit that gives creativity. Probably the deepest thing in a human being, because when we're free, we can create and we can make all things new. And so with that kind of deep power, she's ready to set off. And it's a golden apple, meaning to say it is indeed spiritual, because spiritual things are always symbolized by gold. And she's given a horse, meaning she's got a new vehicle now. That somewhere along the way, that as she's attained to this spiritual quality, she has another vehicle that she can proceed in these more magical realms with a different kind of power. So she got upon the horse and rode a long, long time till she came to another crag, under which sat another old hag with a gold carding comb. Her lassie asked her if she knew the way to the castle that lay east of the sun and west of the moon, and she answered like the first old hag that she knew nothing about it except it was east of the sun and west of the moon. "And thither you'll come later never, but you shall have the loan of my horse to my next neighbor. And maybe she'll tell you all about it, and when you get there, just switch the horse under the left ear and beg him to be off home." And this old hag gave her the gold carding comb. It might be she'd find some use for it, she said. So the lassie got up on the horse and rode far, far away, and a weary time. And so at last she came to another great crag, under which sat another old hag spinning with a gold spinning wheel. Her, too, she asked if she knew the way to the prince, and where the castle was that lay east of the sun and west of the moon. So it was the same thing over again. "Maybe it's you who ought to have had the prince," said the old hag. Yes, it was. But she, too, didn't know the way a bit better than the other two. East of the sun and west of the moon was all she knew, and that was all. "And thither you'll come later never, but I'll lend you my horse, and I think you'd best ride to the east wind and ask him, because maybe he knows those parts and can blow you thither. But when you get to him, you need only give the horse a switch under the left ear, da-da-da, and he'll trot home by himself. And so, too, she gave her the golden spinning wheel. Maybe you'll find a use for it, said the old hag. And it goes on, if the gold apple represents the deepest and most powerful vehicle of the Spirit, the carding comb represents the organizer. This is the creative emanizer. This is the organizer, which is associated with the second power of the Spirit. And the third part of the Spirit is associated with the spinning wheel. The Creator sets up the powerful field. The organizer takes and places everything in its place and brings the word through it, and then the spinner sets everything in motion. You can get this from the deepest of all cosmologies, that the three powers of the Spirit, on whatever level that you're getting them, that there is a creative willing, that there is an organizing or a spoken word, and then everything gets put into motion and gets set into spinning, and the conscious recognition comes from it. And in each case, she is given another vehicle. Then she rode many, many days, a weary time, before she got to the east wind's house. But at last she did reach it, and when she asked the east wind if he could tell her the way to the prince who dwelt east of the sun and west of the moon, yes, the east wind had often heard tell of it, the prince and the castle, but he couldn't tell the way, for he had never blown so far. But if you will, I'll go with you to my brother the west wind. Maybe he knows, for he's much stronger. So if you will just get on my back, I'll carry you thither. Yes, she got on his back, and I should think they went along briskly. So when they got there, they went into the west wind's house, and the east wind said the lassie he had brought was the one who ought to have had the prince who lived in the castle east of the sun and west of the moon. And so she had set out to seek him, and how he had come with her and would be glad to know if the west wind knew how to get to the castle. Nay, said the west wind, so far I've never blown, but if you will, I will go with you to our brother the south wind, for he's much stronger than either of us, and he has flapped his wings far and wide. Maybe he'll tell you. You can get on my back, and I'll carry you to him. You get the gist of it. This is, we'll talk a little bit more about the whole quality of it in a little bit. First, she rides on the winds. We have the threefold Spirit now entering into a fourfold body. Remember, she had three psychic vehicles, or soul vehicles, in the form of the horses, and so we have the threefold Spirit integrating itself into four forms of matter. And the interesting thing to note here is that she, in her consciousness, is riding on, or is floating on the wind, which is a really lovely picture. Meaning to say that she isn't struggling and working like when she first did with the walking, but now she's floating and suspended. And she begins going with the east wind. Everything going with the east is easy. You know, you're going with the tide of humanity. You're going downhill. But that doesn't work. And so she tries going the other direction. She tries going against the grain, and that doesn't get her where she wants to go. But if you look at it, she's really gone nowhere. Because first she went east and she went west, and that means that she finds herself right in the center again. That's the way it is, east of the sun and west of the moon. You think you're going someplace, but you're really not. But then you find out inwardly where you are. It doesn't make any difference anyway. Yes, she got on his back, and so they traveled to the south wind, and weren't so very long on the way, I should think. When they got there, the west wind asked him if he could tell her the way to the castle that lay east of the sun and west of the moon, for it was she who ought to have had the prince who lived there. You don't say so. That is she, is it? Said the south wind. Well, I have blustered about in most places in my time, but so far I've never blown. But if you will, I'll take you to my brother the north wind. He is the oldest and strongest of the whole lot of us, and if he don't know where it is, you'll never tell anyone in the world. You'll never find anyone in the world to tell you. You can get on my back, and I'll carry you thither. Yes, she got on his back, and away he went from his house at a fine rate. And this time, too, she wasn't long on her way. So when they got to the north wind, he was so wild and cross, cold puffs came from a long way off. Blast you both, what do you want? He roared out to them ever so far off, so that it struck them with an icy shiver. Well, said the south wind, you needn't be so foul-mouthed, for here I am, your brother the south wind, and here is the lassie who ought to have had the prince who dwells in the castle that lies east of the sun and west of the moon, and now she wants to know if you ever were there and can tell her the way, for she would be so glad to find him again. Yes, I know well enough where it is, said the north wind. Once in my life I blew an aspen leaf thither, but was so tired I couldn't blow or puff for ever so many days afterward. But if you really wish to go thither and aren't afraid to come along with me, I'll take you on my back and see if I can blow you thither. Yes, with all her heart. She must and would get thither if it were possible in any way, and as for fear, however madly he went, she wouldn't be afraid at all. Very well then, said the north wind, but you must sleep here tonight, for we must have the whole day before us if we're to get thither at all. Early next morning the north wind woke her and puffed himself up and blew himself out and made himself so stout and big 'twas gruesome to look at him. And so off they went up through the air as if they would never stop till they got to the world's end. Down here below, there was such a storm that it threw down long tracts of wood and many houses, and when it swept over the great sea, ships foundered by the hundreds. So they tore on and on. Nobody can believe how far they went. And all the while they went over the sea, and the north wind got more and more weary, so out of breath he could scarcely bring a puff out of his wings, and drooped till at last he sunk so low that the crest of the wave dashed over his heels. Are you afraid? Said the north wind. No, she wasn't. But they weren't very far from land, and the north wind still had so much strength left in him that he managed to throw her up on the shore under the windows of the castle, which lay east of the sun and west of the moon. But when he was so weak and worn out, he had to stay there and rest for many days before he could get home again. Again, the south is worldly power. It's Capricorn land. It's where all of the wealth and power of the world comes from. That buoys us up. But the north has the quality, if you remember in the Greek myths, the north wind was capable of even fertilizing horses. It had such great power to it. And we know in terms of spiritual things that the Christ is crucified on the world cross, and that the top of the world cross is the North Pole, and that the energies that enter into the earth to re-enliven the earth come from the north. So we're talking about a very great creative power that is here. And she's not afraid to deal with this creative power, and it finally gets her somewhere. And it's almost like the spiritual life is like that. Everything seems to be torn away from under you, is destroyed in its wake. And she comes to the very end of the world. We'll skip a few things there and move on. Next morning, the lassie sat down under the castle window and began to play with the golden apple. And the first person she saw was the long nose who was to have the prince. "What do you want for your gold apple, you lassie?" And the long nose threw up the window. "It's not for sale for gold or money," said the lassie. "If it's not for sale for gold or money, what is it that you will sell it for? You may name your own price," said the princess. "Well, if I may get to see the prince who lives here and be with him tonight, you shall have it," said the lassie whom the north wind had brought. Yes, she might. That could be done. So the princess got the gold apple, but when the lassie came up to the prince's bedroom at night, he was fast asleep. She called him and shook him, and between whiles she wept sore, but she couldn't do all she could do. She couldn't wake him. Next morning, as soon as day broke, came the princess with the long nose and drove her out again. So in the daytime she sat under the castle window and began to play and card with the golden carding comb, and the same thing happened. The princess asked what she wanted for it, and she said it wasn't for sale for gold or money, but if she might get to go up to the prince and be able to be with him that night, the princess should have it. But when she went up, she found him fast asleep again, and she called and shook and wept and prayed, and she couldn't get life into him. And as soon as the first gray peep of day came, then the princess with the long nose chased her out again. So in the daytime the lassie sat down under the castle window and began to spin with the golden spinning wheel. And that, too, the princess with the long nose wanted to have. So she threw up the window and asked what she wanted for it. The lassie said, as she had twice before, it wasn't for sale for gold or money, but if she might go up to the prince who was there and be with him alone that night, she might have it. Yes, she might do that and be welcome. But now you must know that there were some Christian folk who had been carried off, and as they sat in their room, which was next to the prince, they heard how a woman had been in there and wept and prayed and called to him 2 nights running, and they told that to the prince. That evening, when the princess came in with her sleepy drink, the prince made as if he had drunk, but threw it over his shoulder, for he could guess it was a sleepy drink. So when the lassie came in, she found the prince wide awake, and she told him the whole story of how she had come thither. I suppose you've figured it all out by now that this is a Christmas story, because the North, I'm intentionally sticking only to this as a heroine story, but there are other levels to it, because the prince could be seen as the sun, and the north wind has driven the lassie way deep to the south. And for 3 days, the prince is in a sleep, which is sort of like Christmas time. This is what solstice means. It means stand still, and it stands still for 3 days. It stays that far south, and it seems as if the sun has no power at all to be awakened or be brought back to life. I think that these are like 3 days of trial. In the ancient initiations, people used to be entranced for 3 days, and then on the 3rd day at sunrise, they woke up and they were then twice born. They were brought back to their body. In those days, they used to use all kinds of means to take people out of the body. But the 3-day trial, that is where everything material is set aside and one enters into a purely spiritual realm that at first one normally sleeps in, is what we're talking about here. What is key is that the lassie, our heroine, takes all of the powers of the spirit and gives them to the lower part of herself, her own rival, because you can't keep anything for yourself. And the wonderful thing about spiritual things is that you can give them, and they'll always do exactly what they're supposed to do. They get you exactly what you need, though it doesn't seem like it at first when you're still looking with the perspective of the material world. So when you see that, then you give those things up. You freely give the spiritual gifts. The Christians, I think, in this, you must remember that this is a fairy tale that comes in a transition time between Norse mythology and the beginnings of Christendom in Scandinavia. And there were witch hunts and things like that. And, for example, the underworld, the Tartarus of the Norse was a land of light that was called Hel, H-E-L. And that was made to be a demonic place, just like in the same way that Spirit Lake up here a few miles is now called Devil's Lake because of the jealous ways of the Christians, of the Catholics, the priests, the insecure people who want to rule, and their religion is the only way, rather than realizing that if they just let the truth be for itself, that would prove itself to be the only way. But at any rate, what happens here is that the Christians represent good parts of ourselves or good deeds or things that we have stored up as soul power in ourselves, and they inform or they begin to give us power, and they begin to get through to the prince, who is obviously, from the feminine point of view, the prince is indeed the divine part, the higher self, to whom she now wants to marry more than anything else, because she's seen the emptiness of material life, and she's seen the emptiness of self-seeking, and she sees that only pain and sorrow can come out of lying in self-seeking. And we won't look at the draft. We'll see that in another time. So we have the last little section to go through. And it says, "Ah," said the prince, "you've come just in the very nick of time, for tomorrow is to be our wedding day, but now I won't have the long nose, and you are the only woman in the world who can set me free. I'll say I want to see what my wife is fit for, and beg her to wash the shirt which has the 3 spots of tallow on it. She'll say yes, for she doesn't know 'tis you who put them there. But that's a work for only Christian folk, and for such a pack of trolls, and not for such a pack of trolls. And so I'll say that I won't have any other for my bride than the woman who can wash them out, and ask you to do it." So there was great joy and love between them all that night. But next day, when the wedding was to be, the prince said, "First of all, I would like to see what my bride is fit for." "Yes," said the stepmother with all her heart. "Well," said the prince, "I've got a fine shirt which I'd like to have for my wedding shirt. But somehow or other it has got 3 spots of tallow on it, which I must have washed out. I have sworn never to take any other bride than the woman who's able to do that. If she can't, she's not worth having." Well, that was no great thing, they said, so they agreed, and she with the long nose began to wash away as hard as she could. But the more she rubbed and scrubbed, the bigger the spots grew. "Ah," said the old hag, her mother, "you can't wash, let me try." But she hadn't taken the shirt in hand before it got far worse than ever. And with all her rubbing and wringing and scrubbing, the spots grew bigger and blacker and darker and uglier was the shirt. Then all the other trolls began to wash, but the longer it lasted, the blacker and uglier the shirt grew, till at last it was black all over as if it had been up the chimney. Oh, I like the "Ah," said the prince, "you're none of you worth a straw. You can't wash. Why, there outside sits a beggar lassie. I'll be bound she knows how to wash better than the whole lot of you. Come in, lassie," he shouted. Well, in she came. "Can you wash this shirt, lassie, you?" said he. "I don't know," she said, "but I think I can." Almost before she had taken it and dipped it in the water, it was white as driven snow and whiter still. "Yes, you are the lassie for me," said the prince. At that the old hag flew into such a rage she burst on the spot, and the princess with the long nose after her, and the whole pack of trolls after her. At least I've never heard a word about them since. As for the prince and the princess, they set free all the poor Christian folk who had been carried off and shut up there, and they took with them all the silver and gold and flitted away as far as they could from the castle that lay east of the sun and west of the moon. And that's the beginning of our story. It's a winter's tale with all kinds of dark thoughts and monstrous things. And this is the first place there's a lot of journey here that we've had in the story. She goes here and there. And it really is an orientation story. I don't know about you. I've been at it for going on 30 years, and it sometimes still seems like when I turn inward that I wander all over the place and never where I want to go or never where I want to be. And that comes out like that. But this is the first case where there's really the work. The flavor of this fairy tale does not have a lot of work in it. And the work is the reduction of selfishness, which is the sunspots, the darkness. We look on the darkness instead of on the light, and we make things more hideous by looking at the bad rather than giving the light of love to something which not only cleans it, but brings something out of it. And selfishness, no matter how it works, can never solve things. You can't play destiny. You know what I mean? You can say, well, if I do this, I'll have good things happen to me. But if you're doing things that way, you're putting selfishness into them, and you're making yourself a really hard, separated kind of place to be in your consciousness where you can't really see the truth for what it is. And so the selfishness can't cleanse itself. And then the challenge is put to her, and all of the trolls don't think she's going to succeed. And it's sort of like the wise will be captured in their folly. And she merely dips the shirt or touches the shirt into the water, and it's cleansed. Now, this isn't a miracle. It's not at all a miracle. In fact, in fairy tales, there rarely are miracles. And there's usually something very, very key when you find a miraculous transformation of one kind or another. And in this case, there is ease in all of this, and I think what is represented by this kind of miracle is that it is her character. If you look at the simple way that the story is laid out, it is by the purity of her character, by the purity of what comes through her, that things appear. This is like doing things the easy way. And so everything is set free. All of the things we knew we could do, but because of our selfishness, because when we start doubting things and we start lying about ourselves. And so setting the Christians free is sort of like there were things we knew we could do all along. And when we once have given up in our selfishness and we've once purged ourselves of trying to do things for selfish ends, immediately these things are released and they come forth as all sorts of talents and abilities. And the union is consummated, and the story begins there, but nothing more is said because it's probably so fabulous that we couldn't speak of it. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more when we come to the end of the next myth. We'll start comparing the myths, and because there are different myths that are for different types of people, and the quality of them is appealing to different people and for what they need to do in themselves. If you want to look ahead at the next myth that we're going to look at, we're going to look at the myth of Perseus in Greek mythology. And it's quite a long myth, and we'll probably take 2 shots at it because it's back in high mythology again. We'll have all sorts of interesting side trips, and we'll continue on from there. I'm sorry that I took so long. I'll try and make them shorter.